Hello everybody, today we're going to be talking about stat scaling in Legion, what your stats actually mean, and what the big changes in Legion were to the stats. So a little while ago they released this post on the forums about the changes to stats, and this basically explains the difference between the stat system from Warlords of Draenor going to Legion. A TLDR basically of what they changed is they made it so your starting secondary stats are going to be a lot higher in the starting of Legion, and then by the end of Legion they're going to be about on par where they were in Warlords of Draenor. So for you increasing your gear, that means you're going to see less difference between when you get a less difference in damage or healing increase as you get a higher piece of gear, as you would have seen say in Warlords of Draenor. So this is to do with how they've changed the scaling. So what they've done now is they've made the secondary stats have a linear scale. So we can see that in the red line here. So that's a linear scale there. So as we start at 800 item level, your secondary stats will pretty much just increase in a straight line. So as you get a piece of gear that's a 5 item level upgrade from say 815 to 820, it might have 20 increased haste, whereas from 850 to 855 it still will have that 20 haste increase. That is not the case for agility and intellect. Agility and intellect have an exponential scaling. So what that means is as you get the 5 level increase at the start, it might be a very little increase, so you might see about 5 intellect increase, but then by the end of the expansion you might see a 5 item level increase might give you a 15 or 20 intellect increase. So that's basically the difference in how the stats were changed. So what we're seeing right now is we're seeing things like the rings, where they have a heavy secondary stat distribution and they have no main stats. So as you can see in the ring right now, you have the 815 ring versus my 850 upgraded ring. So the difference in these stats in the 35 item levels, you have a secondary stat difference of 225. Now, that is just more than a socket. So an interesting thing to note with the rings and the necks is that there isn't actually a very big increase in getting item level for those pieces. So this is a 35 item level increase, and it only has 225 stats. That is not even 1%, of equivalent damage. So what you want to be doing with your rings and necks is you want to be getting something that is your best stats, has a good distribution of your best stats, and then also have a socket. So that is why the crafted ring is an extremely good pickup. The crafted neck is an extremely good pickup because that also has a socket. So those two items are definitely well worth buying, because even if a mythic Nighthold piece of gear drops, might not have your best stats on it, you'll still find your crafted 850 with a socket will still be better. So I would highly recommend going to buy one of those pieces, and that's just because of how the secondary stats scale in this linear fashion. So you don't get too big of an increase from item level as you used to. So eye level isn't something you really need to worry about on your rings and necks. Whereas your other pieces of gear that have intellect, as you can see, this is an 815 to an 850 of the shoulders. They do have a primary stat on them. They're about a medium distribution of stats on shoulders. Your head and chest have more. So as we can see, with a 35 item level increase, we get a 271 intellect gain. For most classes, intellect primary stats will be better than will be a better increase than secondary stats. So if we look at this, we have a heavily distributed secondary stat on the ring, and its increase is less than the main stat increase on the shoulders. So getting an increase on something like your shoulders or any piece of gear with a main stat on it for item level is going to be much more worth it than something like your ring. Just because of the secondary stat difference. But the main stat difference. But the secondary stats still will not scale as much as they normally would. Well, as they would in Waller's Adrenal. So as you can see, this is the 35 item level increase. They're not as heavily weighted, and you're only seeing 119 stat difference in these two pieces of gear. So in conclusion, what you get for that is your items like rings and necks barely scale with item level. Your primary stat will scale a lot with item level. So that we'll see that become the gap become further as well with item level as we get more gear, as you can see in the exponential scaling. So as our item level increases on this line here, the difference in the intellect on the pieces of gear will increase. And then in general, for classes who don't have heavily skewed distribution of stats, so for example, rogues right now, I believe, assassination rogues have very, very, very low values of haste, and that's just because haste doesn't scale very well with their energy regen, doesn't scale their GCD, and doesn't scale on their bleed dot damage. So haste is worth 5 times less than what crit is worth at the moment, even though they're not getting any special bonus from crit. So unless you have a heavily skewed set of stats like assassination rogues at the moment, I believe hunters also do, but I can't confirm that, I haven't looked. But there aren't very many classes who will have this crazy scaling where just an eye level increase will be better. So that's something to note. So this is just one thing as well I want to go over, is just how the secondary stats actually work. So a big thing at the moment was that rogues were being told that versatility was their best stat. That's just flat out wrong. Versatility cannot be your best stat unless you have something that negatively affects crit. So what does that mean? So that means crit is you have a spell that will always crit. So for example, Lava Burst or Eye Beam. Those spells always crit. So your crit value is a dead value for those stats. Now, so as we can see with these stat values, so we have haste. 325 haste will give you 1% haste, right? Which is effectively, if you think about it, 1% damage, because you're doing everything 1% quicker. So now there are classes like Shadow Priest, who, example, 1% more haste might mean you get an extra stack of insanity, which is more than 1% damage. So that's why you see classes like Shadow Priest having really high values of haste, because it affects their class better than just the baseline 1% damage the haste will give you. It has some secondary scalar on that stat. Same with crit. So crit always has been scaling a little bit worse than haste, so it scales about 93% of the efficiency of haste. So crit, just as a stat by itself, if you have no secondary scaling, is worse than haste. And so you have 350 haste for 1% crit, and then versatility is 400. So versatility obviously gives you that damage reduction bonus as well, so that's why it scales a little bit worse. So haste versatility scales at about 80% of haste. So and then mastery is obviously spec dependent, and that's a whole nother ballpark. So to go back to this rogue example we had, they had versatility being the highest stat. That was the case in Warlords of Draenor when you had the 65% base crit on one of your spells. I forgot what it was called, but so you would actually crit cap. But now that crit cap isn't there, crit will be your best stat. Versatility cannot be your best stat for assassination. And that's just versatility in general, unless there is some negative thing impacting crit, which to my knowledge there isn't at this point. I think Holy Paladins are probably going to be the only ones coming close to their soft cap for crit. But like crit should always be weighted higher than versatility. Haste has a few cases, and mastery has a few cases where it's not going to be, but crit should always be higher than versatility. Alright, so the final thing I want to go over with your stats is how they affect each other. So when you're getting more crit, the value of your other stats are worth more. Now that is because your overall damage is, when you add a stat, you're adding to that stat. So it's what we call additive. So when you add 1% crit, you're going to be adding 1% to this 40% value here. So we've done a little this is super basic simulation. It has no real world application. It just shows you how the stats work together. So we have our base DPS will be 100. So we're doing 100 damage per second. We have our stats are going to be, in this case, we have a heavily favored crit. And we're assuming crit is just, we have no secondary scaling. Everything's worth equal. But that's here nor there. So this is just a base case. So if we're heavily weighted towards crit in this case, our crit is going to give us 40% damage, which will make our outcome 40% higher. So we see that we have this 140% outcome. And that is because we have our base damage, we multiply it by the 140% crit, then we multiply it by every other stat we have. So each stat has its additive value, which is the column, which is this row here, plus 1. So this works out being 100 times 1.4, and then that'll give us our end there of 140. So for our case 2, we have a even distribution of stats. So that 40% is now distributed evenly between every stat we have, right? And so as we can see, the outcome now is slightly higher than the outcome we would have of base crit. So what does this mean? So this means that as you're getting more stats, so the more crit you get, the more value Haste has, right? And the more value versatility has, and the more value mastery has. And this is just because of how the stats calculate together. You're doing 100 base damage, you have a 40% chance to crit, so on average you're going to be having 40% more damage from that crit, and then you're going to be having more damage from haste, and then more damage from versatility, and then more damage from mastery on top of everything. That's just how they multiply together. But when you're actually adding the stat, that's an additive stat to that crit amount. So again, to conclude, as you get more of a specific stat, the value of your other stats increase. So when you're getting pieces of gear, that might be 15 item levels higher, oh no, it has versatility. Well, you might not have versatility. So versatility probably won't be that bad a stat for your class. That's just the way it is. So I just wanted to make this video just to kind of show how the stats work together, how the secondary stats are scaling at the moment, and the difference between the Warlords of Draenor stat model and the difference between the Legion stat model. It does make some interesting choices with the necks and rings. But yeah, I hope you enjoyed and I hope you learned something. I might revisit this more in detail on some of the cases. I just wanted to make something showing off what's going on in Legion at the moment. Thank you.